Alright, what's going on everyone? In this video I'm going to show you how to upgrade the Rakdos Vampires Challenger deck on a budget. All prices in this video will be in US dollars, and I know that isn't relevant to everyone, but the goal is to not spend more than the retail price of the deck with our upgrades, which is around $25 to $30 USD. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how much we're spending. So first off, Rakdos Vampires, it's an interesting case. Around the time these decks were announced a couple months ago, if you watched my initial reaction video, Rakdos Vampires was a solid competitive deck, and it also pretty accurately depicted what the vampire deck would look like after Kamigawa, because the post-Kamigawa vampire deck did have like Oni-Cult Anvil and that sort of blood token artifact sacrifice package, but over time the vampires were basically completely abandoned, and now this deck, or the closest thing to it in the metagame, is actually a Rakdos artifact sacrifice deck. All the vampires have been replaced with just more artifacts and artifact sacrifice stuff with some vampires. The vampires that produce blood tokens are still in the deck, but all the tribal vampires that just care about vampires and don't produce blood tokens have been largely abandoned. So today I'm going to assume that you bought a deck titled Rakdos Vampires because you want to play a tribal vampire deck. So we're going to upgrade it into the best vampire deck that we can, pretty close to the tier 1 vampire deck from a couple months ago. But I'll also talk about that artifact deck if you're more interested in just getting as close to the current meta deck as you can. We'll go over that, talk about it a little bit in the second half of this video. So first off, let's take out the village rights for Deadly Dispute. I talked about this in my gameplay video. No reason to have village rights in this deck. Deadly Dispute is just significantly better in this deck. So they both let us sacrifice a creature to draw 2 cards. Deadly Dispute does cost 1 more, but we can sacrifice artifacts. We don't have to sacrifice a creature. Sacking a creature in response to a removal spell is still fine, but also just being able to toss a blood token for 2 more cards is also pretty great. And even though it costs 1 extra mana, it makes a treasure token, so it sort of makes up for it. And that's also another artifact that we can sacrifice to the anvil and stuff, so it's just better. And speaking of the anvil, I want to take out 2 Mukotai Soul Rippers for 2 more Oni-Cult Anvils. These vehicles are okay, but I find them just a little clunky. I don't know, they don't synergize with the deck very well. There's a very small amount of synergy in that it can sacrifice stuff, but I often find that I'm just a little bit underwhelmed with these. And the anvils, on the other hand, are just amazing. They do tremendous work in this deck, sacrificing blood tokens, draining life, making tokens. They just make this deck super grindy. A very important part to both the Rakdos artifact sacrifice deck as well as the vampires deck when it was popular. So for Oni-Cult Anvils, perfectly happy to have those. Next, I want to take out 2 Sockens and Smelters for 2 more Deadly Disputes. So these Smelters are much more popular in the artifact focused deck, but it feels a little awkward in the vampire deck being a goblin. It does have synergies with the artifact package, but I just find that it makes the vampire half of the deck feel a little suboptimal. So replacing these with extra Deadly Disputes seems fine to me. These, in addition to the Florians in the deck, is going to give us a ton of ways to dig. We can dig deep into our deck, generate a ton of card advantage. That's what this deck is really about. It's a grindy mid-range deck, so having tons of card draw, great. And I just love being able to sacrifice my blood tokens for more cards. It's very useful. And speaking of Florian, I want to take out Dominating Vampire for a 3rd copy of him. Dominating Vampire is kind of amazing in a vampire aggro deck. If you're going super fast, having a 3 mana 3/3 that yanks a blocker out of the way is just fantastic. I would definitely consider Dominating Vampire in like an aggro deck with some of the more aggro creatures like Falconwrath Pit Fighter, for example. You know, these really fast, low cost, aggressive vampires. Dominating Vampire would be pretty good there, but in this deck, Florian, a sturdy vampire with first strike that it digs for more vampires, is pretty good with what we're doing in this specific build. I also want to take out the other Dominating Vampire for a 3rd Vampire Socialite. This is really good at giving us some battlefield presence. It's a 2 mana 2/2, dishes out counters when it enters, and then makes all of our future vampires bigger, potentially if the opponent lost life. What's interesting about this card is when I initially played it, I was actually considering taking Socialite out of the deck. I just didn't think it was that good in this version of the deck, because we're not necessarily all in on vampires. But now that we have so many copies of Deadly Dispute and Florian, I find this is actually much better, just because we're so much more capable now of digging for more and more vampires that we can sort of feed the Socialite fight and just, take advantage of that ability much better. So even though I didn't like it in the initial build, now that we have all the card advantage and card draw, I actually like it a lot more. Helps us sort of get over the opponent sometimes after we've just generated a ton of card advantage. It also feels fantastic to cast off of a Florian when we attack and we reveal it, and we could play that and just put counters on everything that attacked. Always feels pretty good. So yeah, decent. Perfectly happy to have another one of those. I also want to take out Henrika for Soren the Mirthless. These have fortunately gone significantly down in price since people have moved away from vampires and into the artifact version, which is great because Soren is pretty good in a tribal vampires deck. His plus ability is a little painful. You get a card, but you lose a life equal to the mana value of the card you get, but he makes up for it by making tokens with lifelink and also just having a fairly constant source of vampires in a vampire deck. Also pretty great. And because this deck is so mid-rangey and grindy, Planeswalker, always a solid choice in a deck that's looking to go long and drag the game out. So yeah, perfectly happy with that. Next we have a sideboard swap to make. I want to take out 2 Embersturm Predators for the 2 Angies that are in the sideboard. This is a free upgrade, you just need to swap these. The Predator is great and I want access to it in the sideboard because it's an evasive threat and it eats graveyards, and both of those things are pretty important to have access to, but I prefer Angi main board because it's another opportunity to create blood tokens. This deck is all about blood tokens and creating artifacts and getting advantage from that. So I actually prefer Angi. She also drains life. We can just start chucking our blood tokens at our opponent that drain too. So Angi and Oni Cult Anvil eating through our blood tokens, draining life, making construct tokens, that can really sustain us in a long game. Pretty great. So game 1, I would much rather have access to this, but it is nice to have those extra 2 dragons in the sideboard, so don't want to take the Predators out entirely. I just want Angi mainboard Predators for game 2 and 3 if we need evasion or graveyard hate. I also have a couple of small changes I want to make to the sideboard. I think it's worth taking out an Abrade for a Ray of Enfeeblement. So Abrade is great, but this deck has 4 copies, and I think that's maybe too much. Seems a little excessive. So let's go down to 3 and bring in an incredibly great removal spell for the white aggro deck. It's 1 mana, gives -4/-4 in that matchup. Very strong, kills basically everything in that deck. Also, it's optional, and this is definitely optional, but you can take out another Abrade for a Feed the Swarm. So this is going to be dependent on your metagame because you're basically just swapping out an artifact destruction spell for an enchantment hate spell. Naya Runes or Naya Enchantments is a super popular deck, and having some way to remove enchantments is nice. Although if no one in your local metagame is playing enchantments, it might not be as necessary. I still think it's nice having one just in case, but if you're having trouble with artifacts, if there's lots of artifacts in your metagame, you can just keep the 3 Abrades, but this is just something to consider. If you're having trouble with the Naya Runes deck, Feed the Swarm is one of your only options, unfortunately. Black and red aren't very good at removing enchantments. Feed the Swarm works, little painful, but it's better than just losing to an enchantment that you can't answer, right? Also, this is also optional, but I think it's worth taking out a mountain for a Sokken's Crucible of Defiance. You can add more, you can have 3 or 4 of these if you want. Just keep in mind that they are legendary and you cannot have more than 1 on the battlefield, so it's dangerous if you draw multiple of them in your opening hand. You potentially can't play them, but a single copy doesn't hurt. Don't have to worry about the legend roll if you only have 1 copy in your deck, and if you're mana flooded, you can channel it, get a couple tokens. Not bad. No, it's not like the most amazing thing ever, but it doesn't hurt, right? You have a mountain that occasionally can be pitched for some tokens if you're flooded, so doesn't hurt. These things are only like $1 or $2. I'd say it's definitely worth getting 1 in at least. And this is our finished list. I'm pretty happy where we're at. The deck is intended to combine tribal vampires and artifact sacrifice synergies, but in the original deck there were just a few cards that didn't mesh well with one half of the deck or the other. So now everything should feel a little bit more cohesive, more cohesion, more consistency. That's what our upgrades did here. But let's talk about that artifact sacrifice deck. If you're interested in it, basically you need to pull out all of the vampires in this deck that don't care about blood tokens. The only 2 vampires that the artifact sacrifice deck plays is Voldaren Epicure and Blood Tithe Harvester. These are still heavily played as they produce blood tokens, and they're pretty good at it. You know, a 1 mana and a 2 mana creature that produce blood tokens as they enter is what this particular deck is looking for. Then you're going to fill the deck back up with things like Experimental Synthesizer and Dragon Spark Reactor. So the Synthesizer is amazing amazing. 1 mana, and you reveal the top card of your library and you can play it this turn. So it's like a 1 mana draw card, kind of, but more importantly, it's an artifact hitting the battlefield. And then that ability also triggers when it leaves the battlefield. It does have a sacrifice ability. You can sacrifice it, make a token, but you can also just sacrifice it to the anvil, and sacrificing it to the anvil will still get you another free card. Plus the anvil will put out a construct token and drain life, right? And then Dragon Spark Reactor, every single time we play an artifact, it gets a counter, and then you can sacrifice it to deal damage based on how many counters it has. So this gets counters even when artifact tokens enter the battlefield. So blood tokens, treasure tokens, and the construct tokens from the anvil all trigger this. So this artifact sacrifice deck is really good at just churning through tokens. You know, vampires make blood tokens, Deadly Dispute sacrifices blood tokens to make a treasure token, draws more cards. The synthesizer puts an artifact in play, gets you 2 cards potentially, right? All this card advantage, and you're just building up this giant Dragon Spark Reactor to blow up in the opponent's face. And also it plays things like a Blood Fountain and Sanguine Statuette, which kind of double trigger Dragon Spark Reactor because they are both artifacts. So that puts a charge counter on it, and then they make blood tokens, which puts another counter on it, right? So basically, the artifact version of a couple vampires, but it's really just about going crazy with blood tokens, treasure tokens, construct tokens, just generating tons and tons and tons of value, and then blowing up a reactor in the opponent's face. That's the idea with the Rakdos Sacrifice deck, but that deck's entirely different. This is our deck, and it's pretty solid still. Looks very similar to the vampire deck that was relevant in the metagame like a month ago, right? People have been favoring the artifact deck, but this was still a top tier deck literally a month ago, so still a solid deck. But yeah, there you go, guys. Check the description below. I will leave a link to those artifact decks if you're interested, and I'll also leave a link to this deck list if you want to refer back to it later. So hopefully that's useful. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out the other guides if you're interested, and I will see you in the next one.